Imagine for a moment you've lived your whole life abroad, built a career, a family, a whole community, and then one day you get this letter. And it throws everything into question. Suddenly you realize your nationality, maybe something you barely thought about, might actually be a huge financial and emotional burden, something you never ever signed up for. Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving deep into the often hidden complexities, the significant impact of U.S. citizenship for Americans living abroad. And this isn't just about taxes, folks. It's about identity, freedom, this whole intricate system of citizenship-based taxation. It's really unique in the world, especially after laws like FATCA came along.
Right. And for this deep dive, we're looking at a really powerful presentation. It's called Sacred Trust Counseling Clients Through the Trauma of U.S. Citizenship Abroad in a FATCAesque World. It's by John Richardson from back in February 2015. And it gives this quite stark firsthand look at what individuals caught in this situation are actually facing.
Yeah, stark is a good word. So our mission today is to pull out the most critical insights from this material, help you understand the different layers here, and hopefully give you some aha moments about a situation maybe many people don't even know exists. Why should you care? Well, because it's a global issue, really, with profound personal and economic consequences. It touches on belonging, managing finances, even how you participate in the world. Okay, so our research, it kicks off by describing what it calls the terrible twos. Two OMG moments people have. First, that sort of gut punch realization, OMG, I'm a U.S. person, OM. And then the follow-up, which can be devastating. OMG, I have to file U.S. taxes. And this isn't just numbers, is it? It's described as this emotional tidal wave fear, confusion, sometimes just outright denial. It really shows the personal trauma involved here.
It does. And what's really fascinating right from the prologue of this presentation is how it points out that congressional legislation, well, it was aimed at specific targets, sure, but it had these massive, often unforeseen consequences. It created what the source calls an anxious condition for so many people, pushing them towards potential sacrifice of wealth, even insolvency. And the striking part, these are often people who are mostly unlikely to do anything at all that would normally attract this kind of attention. It really speaks to this system of universal self-assessment of taxation. The goal, it seems, is almost to keep the taxpayer perpetually anxious, make sure they don't underpay or, ideally, maybe even overpay.
Wow, using anxiety as a compliance tool, that sounds intense. Is that maybe too cynical, or is that really how the system ends up working in practice? And what actually kicked off this FATCA reality? What started these OMG moments? How did it all begin?
Well, it's maybe less about cynicism and more about just the practical effect of really broad legislation, When you cast such a wide net, you inevitably catch people who were never the intended target. The system essentially deputizes every individual to constantly check their own compliance under penalty. And that's a huge burden. What really ignited this specific modern challenge was the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA. This huge piece of legislation set off what our source calls the FATCA hunt. It officially started July 1st, 2014. And suddenly, financial institutions everywhere were tasked with searching their client list for people with U.S. indicia.
U.S. indicia. Okay, that sounds a bit like something out of a detective novel. What kind of clues are they actually looking for?
Exactly. U.S. indicia are basically any hints that someone might be a U.S. person. It could be a U.S. birthplace, a U.S. address mailing or residence, a U.S. phone number, even a social security number. If these clues pop up, it triggers a requirement. People have to answer specific questions, provide more documents, and this often leads to what's known as the FATCA letter, where the bank asks clients to fill out detailed forms, or sometimes they're even told, look, you need to move your accounts. The bank just doesn't want the reporting hassle.
Right. So this whole process, as our research points out, it forces countless people to confront this question.
Yeah.
Am I a U.S. person?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not always straightforward, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people genuinely don't know, or they think they aren't, and then surprise.
Precisely. And the core of the challenge isn't always who is a U.S. person, but sometimes, even more critically, who is not a U.S. person. The ways you can deny U.S. citizenship, or rather establish that you've already relinquished it, they're complex. They're found in various agreements like the Model I Intergovernmental Agreement. Basically, treaties between the U.S. and other countries to implement FATCA reporting. And while being born or naturalized in the U.S. is the obvious start for being a U.S. person, it's definitely not the whole story. You also have to consider whether relinquishment has occurred under Section 349A of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And that's where the legal stuff really gets tangled up with personal history.
And there are these specific nuances people might easily misunderstand. Like our research clearly says, never presume that children born to U.S. citizens abroad are U.S. persons. That's huge, right? But then conversely, it does include green card holders as U.S. persons, even if they've lived outside the U.S. for ages. So it's not just about where you were born. It's a whole mix of factors.
Absolutely. It gets so complex that our source talks about sending clients to a determination of U.S. personhood lab, metaphorically, of course. Here, the deep dive isn't just into paperwork, it's into their whole life story, because all facts bear on the question of whether the person intended to relinquish U.S. citizenship at the time of performing the Expatriating Act, that's Section 349 again. These expatriating acts, they've evolved, but they include things like naturalizing in another country, taking an oath to a foreign state, serving in a foreign military, holding certain foreign government jobs. But the crucial thing is the intent. What was in their mind when they did it? For example, someone born in the U.S. might automatically get citizenship in another country at birth. If they never intended to give up their U.S. ties, that's different from someone actively seeking foreign citizenship specifically to cut ties with the U.S.
Okay, so you go through this metaphorical lab, you dig into intent and history, and you determine, okay, yes, you are what the source calls a live U.S. person. What happens then? What's the next big decision point? This is where the rubber meets the road, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, once that identity piece is confirmed, this really fundamental question comes up. Does the person want to remain a U.S. person or renounce? It's a massive fork in the road. And like our source says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will do. So that initial decision, remain or renounce, it shapes everything that comes next. Compliance options, life choices, all of it.
Definitely. And if someone starts exploring renunciation, our source outlines this new know your client rule. It breaks down the objective factors you have to weigh. These are the tangible things, your assets, your business interests, your overall net worth, any unrealized capital gains.
Then there are practicalities like marital status, whether you have a criminal record, especially if you still want to be able to visit the U.S., and a really big one. Do you want your children to be U.S. citizens?
Yeah.
The material says these are anything and everything you need to think about. It's a full financial and legal picture to map out the costs and consequences.
But it's not just about the numbers and the laws, right? The source really emphasizes the personal side, the subjective factors, which often hit even harder. It's not all spreadsheets. That's so true. The subjective stuff is often right at the heart of this huge decision. You've got issues of identity, that really deep feeling of, I've always thought of myself as American, a sense of self built over decades. Then there are these issues surrounding primal emotions of fear, anger, and betrayal. A lot of clients wrestle with issues surrounding guilt, like, as a U.S. person, I am hurting or a burden to my family, especially if their status causes problems for non-U.S. relatives or business partners. And there's often this strong feeling coming from issues surrounding being targeted in the FATCA roundup. People feel like it's unjust, it's inhumane, I didn't choose where I was born. It's fascinating how central these emotions are. It really underlines that trauma aspect we mentioned earlier.
Okay, so what if you choose the other path? You decide to remain a U.S. person abroad, maybe embrace the identity you've always known. Our source is pretty blunt about it. It's a lot of work and very expensive. It's not just carrying on as usual.
No, it really isn't. The source clearly states that U.S. persons abroad simply do not have the same life opportunities as people of other nationalities. Think about it. A small business owner, maybe in Germany, suddenly can't bring in a new partner or even open an account with their local bank just because they were born in the U.S. decades ago and haven't lived there since. This leads to restrictions on retirement planning. You need very specialized financial counseling just to figure it out. There are restrictions on how they can carry on business, making entrepreneurship, or even just holding certain jobs way more complicated. It gets tricky with marriage if only one partner is a U.S. person, creating potential headaches for managing shared assets. And then, of course, there's the reality of hefty compliance costs every year, just to stay compliant. Sometimes the cost of filing is more than the actual tax owed.
Wow. It's clear that staying a U.S. citizen abroad comes with some serious day-to-day challenges. Like our source puts it, quite powerfully, makes people ask themselves, how do you like your freedom now? That's a heavy question. It highlights the burden, not just a simple choice. And if you decide, okay, I can't do this, I need to renounce, well, that's a whole other incredibly complex journey. Right, let's pivot to that path renunciation. Our source calls it death and rebirth, this process of meticulously getting the affairs in order. And a critical first step mentioned is making sure the client has a second citizenship, a place to land, legally speaking.
Exactly. The process often starts with looking at Form 8854, the Statement of Expatriation. This form determines if you're considered covered or not covered under the expatriation tax rules. If you're covered because your net worth is over $2 million, the source says it's very common to explore ways of reducing that net worth before renouncing. Making gifts, for example. If you're covered because your average tax bill over the last 5 years is too high, that's very rare. But sometimes we may wait a year or so for that average to drop. But most often, clients are covered because they can't certify 5 years of tax compliance. In those cases, the advisors help them meet the test, often using streamlined compliance options. The exact solution depends on the client's age, wealth, risk tolerance. This prep work is absolutely vital because of what comes next.
And that leaves us straight to the dreaded exit tax. What exactly does this mean for someone giving up their citizenship?
The exit tax works on this really stark idea. It basically assumes you sold all your property the day before you expatriated. It's called a deemed disposition. You face capital gains tax on a pretend gain, even if you didn't actually sell a thing. So the government taxes you as if you cashed everything out, whether you did or not. Now, there are exceptions, but you have to be very careful with non-U.S. pensions and other deferred income items. The rules are in the Internal Revenue Code specific sections, and the source warns it looks more simple than it is. The bottom line, the exit tax can lead to very significant amounts of tax owing.
Ouch. Our source really sums it up. The price for your freedom may be high, and it doesn't stop there. There's also all the critical paperwork involved with expatriation.
Yes. It's crucial to know if you're a non-covered expatriate, meaning the exit tax doesn't apply, or a covered expatriate where it does apply. And our source really stresses the massive importance of timing requirements in relation to all forms. The consequences for messing up are severe. If you fail to file or file late, very bad things can happen. You will become a covered expatriate, which means the exit tax applies. The source actually calls this failure the horror of covered expatriate status. That tells you how serious it is, high stakes.
Moving away from the technical stuff for a second, our source really dives into the human side of the sacred trust involved in counseling these clients. Why is this role so unique for advisors? It seems different from typical financial planning.
Oh, absolutely. This is where being an advisor goes way beyond just finance. The source calls it a sacred trust because it emphasizes clients are extremely vulnerable, and any mistakes can be life-altering. It gives new meaning to the phrase trusted advisor because, quite literally, their future is in your hands. Advisors often end up being more like life counselors than tax or legal advisors simply because, well, bad things happen to good people. You're navigating an emotional minefield, fear, anger, betrayal, just as much as a legal one. The pressure on advisors is huge. The really critical question they need to ask isn't just what's your net worth, but what do you want your life to look like in 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, the concluding thoughts in our source really hammer this home, the depth of counseling needed. It talks about working with clients over multiple sessions, giving them time and space to process everything, helping them respond to the situation and not react. That's key. Even suggesting send them on a vacation to let them think clearly, away from the immediate stress. And it notes counselors have to do a lot of background work before getting to the tax issues, because citizenship counseling includes, but is not limited to tax counseling. It just underlines those degrees of trauma people go through and the kind of comprehensive, empathetic support they really need. The source ends with this powerful reflection, reminding us that U.S. citizenship taxation, place of birth taxation, is absolutely unique in the world. And it connects this to broader implications, quoting historians. As goes taxes, so go civilizations. Which leads us to think about the bigger picture.
That's a crucial point. If you connect this whole issue to the bigger picture, it really raises questions about the systemic impact of these laws, not just on individuals, but on the U.S. itself. Our source quotes Mark, professor in Europe, who says, quite bluntly, that U.S. citizens are now toxic to most all international banks. But it gets worse. He says they are toxic and unwanted in business partnerships abroad, as once they hold more than 10% of the business venture, the entire business falls under U.S. tax reporting.
Wow.
Yeah. He continues, that is unthinkable and unacceptable for the other non-U.S. partners, so the U.S. person is systematically excluded from the rapidly growing global economy of startups and international business ventures. That quote just highlights the huge systemic problems these policies create. He finishes by saying, in many countries, banks immediately advise business startups that they will not handle their accounts if there is any U.S. participation whatsoever. So this isn't just about personal finance anymore. It's about the nation's global economic reach and the opportunities being denied to its own citizens living abroad.
It really brings it home, doesn't it? The profound systemic impact, how these policies affect individual lives, yes, but also global business, making U.S. citizenship for those abroad, not just a burden, but potentially a barrier to even participating in the global economy. So we've covered a lot of ground today. Unpack the personal, the financial trauma of U.S. citizenship abroad. From that initial shock discovering you're a U.S. person subject to this unique tax system, through the maze of FATCA, the agonizing choice, remain or renounce, and that daunting exit tax. It's clearly a journey filled with huge decisions, often touching the very core of someone's identity and their future.
Absolutely. And the core lesson from our research today, I think, is that this isn't just a tax issue, not even close. It's a profound life decision. It affects identity, family, future opportunities, everything. It's really about empowering people to make informed choices, proactive ones, not just reacting out of fear or confusion when faced with these overwhelming circumstances. It really gives that phrase, sacred trust, a whole new weight for the advisors involved.
Definitely. And as you, our listeners, reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider the provocative question our source leaves us with. U.S. citizenship taxation, place of birth taxation, is unique in the world. What effect will this have on the future of the USA? How does a policy that, even unintentionally, makes its own citizens toxic and parts of the global economy, how does that ultimately shape a nation's standing and its people's lives? It's a question worth pondering, far beyond just the numbers in the legal code.